Okay, undoubtedly at this point you have lots of questions about HTML5, what we did, why do we do it. Like I said, that's great. Beginning in lesson number 4, we're going to examine virtually every single tag and concept that we added to the document in the previous lesson. Also, I'm sure that you were left completely unimpressed by the visual stylings, the design, the aesthetic quality of the page that we created. So that's really the focus of this lesson, to demonstrate the thought process and the workflow of laying out and applying styles to our HTML5 web pages. There will be plenty that you will not understand, but please follow along, do what I do. Some of it will make sense, some of it will form questions in your mind that will be then answered when we get to that point in the series of lessons beginning in lesson number 12. Okay, so before we get started, there's some unfinished business that we need to tend to. It came to my attention that we have some mistakes, not only the ones that I intended to put in there, but then also ones that were added unintentionally. So make sure that you download the Lesson 03 code from wherever you're currently watching this video or wherever you originally downloaded it from. Inside of that folder, we're going to have a before folder that will be an exact copy of where we ended in lesson 2. I just renamed the file. Okay, and so I'm going to copy all these assets, and then I'm going to go back to the work folder and paste them all in, and this is where we're going to do the majority of our work for this lesson. Okay, so next up, what we need to do is open up our lesson03.html page, and what I want to do is run our web page through a validator, and a validator will check the code that we've written to make sure that it conforms to the standards that we said, or the contract that we said that we're adhering to whenever we declare the doc type at the top of this HTML document. We'll talk about this in the next lesson. So what I want to do is open up my web browser and go to a popular validator. It's called validator.nu, and I'm going to choose the text field for the validator input. I'm going to go back to my document, hit Control A, Control C to copy the entire document out of my clipboard. Go back to Internet Explorer, Control A to select all the example HTML that they create for us, and then Control V to paste in our page. And I'm going to click the Validate button, and as soon as I do, we're going to get a couple of errors. And so the first one, it gives us a line number and a column, and it kind of gives us a general idea of where and what the problem is. Now, unfortunately, because I have word wrap on, it's not going to be exactly in the line that it said it was in. However, I happen to know that the problem here is that I opened an H1 tag, but I didn't close the H1 tag. I just created another opening H1 tag. So if I add a / and click Save, that should fix that problem. We'll check into that one more time in just a moment once we make all of our changes. Now I'm going to scroll down to where the two articles kind of butt up against each other, when one article ends and the other one begins, and I intended to put an HR, which stands for a horizontal rule, but it has a semantic meaning of separating two ideas or two unrelated items. And so we'll come back to the semantic meaning of HR much later in the series, but I wanted to include it here so that you can be exposed to it. And then I want to go to the very bottom of this document. If we were to look at the other error, this number 5, a stray end tag, AIS. Now this is the one that we planted intentionally. I have an opening aside and a closing tag that I mistyped intentionally. So I'm going to rename that aside, so closing aside. Save all these changes that I made, Control A to select everything and Control C to copy it. I'm going to go back and revalidate this document by clicking Control A to select everything in the text field, and then Control V to paste in our updated version, and click the Validate button one more time. And this time we get the document validates message. Success. Okay, so we can continue on now. That's awesome. I'm going to close this down, and we do need to make an addition now to our lesson03.html file. We're going to attach an external cascading style sheet file to this document so that when our web browser loads this up, it's going to see the link that we created, and it's going to go out and then request that resource from the web server or in this case, just our local desktop machine. So to create one of those, I'm going to go underneath the title, but before the end of the head section, I'm going to create link. Rel or relationship is styles sheet. That's the relationship of this link to this HTML document. Type equals text/CSS, no spaces. Href equals, and then the name of the file that we want to include. So styles.css. And then finally, media equals screen. And we'll talk about media elements later. I'm going to save that, and now I'm going to open up a second version of Notepad, and I'm going to create the styles.css file. So just so we have something in there to begin with, I'm going to style the entire body, setting the font for the entire document. So I'm going to select the body. So I'm creating a CSS selector and say, basically, I want to change the font family to Arial. However, in case they don't have the Arial font on their computer, I'm going to say a worthy substitute would be Helvetica. And if they don't have either of those fonts, then any sans serif classification of font will do just fine. So now I'm going to File, Save As. I'm going to make sure to navigate to the appropriate folder, the Lesson 03 work folder. I'm going to change the Save As type to All Files, change the encoding to UTF-8, and I'm going to call this styles.css, and then click Save. Now if we did everything correctly, I should be able to open this file and we will see a Arial, or rather sans serif font. And we do, and simply by sans serif we don't see any of the decorative elements that we would normally see in the default font, which would be like a Times New Roman that has little flares off on the ends of the S's, and the E's look different and the A's look different. Okay, so we're working with an Arial font, and that much is obvious if you're familiar with fonts and typography. Great. Okay, so what we've been able to accomplish here so far is to create our first style. We have created a style by setting one attribute to a new value. Okay? And so now it's time for us to think about how we want to lay out our web page. In my mind, I've already given this a lot of thought. I want three distinct sections. There will be a head, there will be kind of the main area where all the text will reside, and then at the very bottom, a small footer. Now the head and the footer I want to be black with white text. In the main section, I want there to be white text with a black font. Kind of the chrome around the entire document I want to be a dark gray color. I also want there to be a thick border all the way around the document, a black border. And as far as the header is concerned and the footer, I want this Channel 9 and HTML5 and CSS fundamentals to be on the left-hand side, and then I want to represent this navigation area over on the right hand side, and I want it to be horizontal, not vertical the way that we see here, and I want to get rid of the little bullet points. Furthermore, I think at the very end of the document we have this aside, and I want to format that specially. I'm going to put it in a smaller font. I'm going to give it a bright green background, and I'm going to give it a green border with rounded corners so that we can exercise that new feature in Internet Explorer 9's CSS3 capabilities. And the same would be true then with the footer area. I want this copyright notice on the left, and then again our navigation to be on the right hand side. So to accomplish all that, I'm going to go back to the body, and I'm going to add that dark gray color which will provide the chrome around the background of the web page. So here we go. I'm going to set the background color colon pound symbol 333 333, and so I happen to know that this is a hexadecimal value that represents a dark gray color. So I'm going to save that, and now if I refresh my web page, you can see that it indeed turns the entire body of the document gray. And you might be thinking, well, that was counterproductive because don't we need some black area backgrounds and some white background areas as well? So let's go ahead and then style up the three parts that we know comprise those sections. We have a header, we have the main section that contains the two articles, and then we also have a footer. And I'm going to make these the same in all three cases. I am going to, for example, make the header width colon 80%. So that will make the amount of horizontal space that it takes up less than the entire width of the browser, leaving 20% as the Chrome area to the left and the right. Okay. Now let's just go ahead and set the background color to black, and then the foreground color for all the text inside of it I'm going to set to white. Now notice in these two cases I was able to use named colors instead of hexadecimal colors. When we get to the part where we're talking about colors much later in this series, there's several different ways to define colors. These are just two of the more popular ways to do it. So let's just look at what we've accomplished here so far. Refresh our web page. And you can see we definitely get this header section that's only 80% of the entire web page. The background is black. The Channel 9 and the HTML5 and CSS3 fundamentals is in white text. That's great. However, it's not centered, and that's really what I want. So we're going to have to use this little trick. We're going to use margin dash right auto and margin left auto. And this is just one of many tricks that have been developed or have been realized over time to do things which would seem to be simple, however require a few extra steps in cascading style sheets. So here we have a centered area, and that's awesome. And I want to apply that same styling then to the section and then the footer as well. So let's copy most of this and just paste it in both sections. However, in the section I want to leave the color alone and set the background color to white. And save this, and now let's refresh. Alright, so in a very short period of time we've gotten a pretty nice little layout here. Great. So now we have some things like spacing, we have margin and padding issues, and so let's go ahead and spend some time figuring out what we can do here to clean up some of these sorts of things. First thing I want to do in the header was to add some padding around the inside of the header area because all that text was butted up too close to the edges here, and that makes me a little uncomfortable. So that gives us a little more spacing. However, for my tastes, a little bit too much spacing, so we may come back and modify some parts of this. Also, I don't like the fact that the text here in our paragraphs are butted up right against the side. So what I'll do is for every paragraph, I'm going to set its padding, or I think probably let's try margin instead. I think that's what I want. 10 pixels. Okay, so you can see we get 10 pixels, a small amount of padding, or rather margin area, between the text and the side here. Great. Furthermore, since we're working with that section, I want to place a border, and I'm going to define it longhand, so I'm going to set the border color to black, the border style to solid, and the border width to 5 pixels. And now we get this nice thick border all the way around. Awesome. The next thing I want to do is focus on the H1s and the H2s and the H3s below. There's not a lot of differentiation between them, and so I'm going to set the default styles for each of those. Furthermore, this H1 doesn't look like this H1, so I want to standardize those sizes. So to do that, here I'm going to go arbitrarily here and just type in an H1, an H2, and an H3. And for the H1, I'm going to set its font size to 2 EM, which means 200% of the default font size for the web browser. I'll set the font size to 1.6 for the H2, and then the font size to 1.3 for the H3. So this basically says 60% larger than your normal font size and 30% larger than the normal font size. That's used in the rest of the document. Okay, so let's go ahead and refresh and see what that does for us. Alright, so now this definitely makes this much larger, and it makes the H2s considerably smaller and the H3s smaller yet. Great. Furthermore, if I look at this document, in both cases I don't like how much vertical spacing there is between the H1 and what's below it and above it, so I'm going to modify that as well. In fact, I'm going to reset it, both the margin and the padding, to 0. And then I'm going to reset specifically the padding top to 10 pixels. So let's see what this does for us. Okay. Next up, let's deal with this H group, including the H1 and the H2. And what we're going to do is treat this whole area inside here as 100%. And so we're going to commit 70% of the space inside of here to this header group, and then 30% of the space to this group. Furthermore, we're going to move that all the way over here to the right hand side. And so let's go ahead and work on that. So here we go, H group. And we're going to set the H group to a width of 70% of its parent. And then we'll float that to the left. Then we'll take the nav section, and we're going to set its width to 30%, and we're going to float that to the right. Let's see what that does. Alright, so this looks very odd right now because we haven't finished quite yet. We have an issue that since we're using floated areas, our header just doesn't know enough about what's inside of it to render it correctly. So what we're going to have to do is do a little trick here with this header section, and I'm going to add an overflow of hidden and see if that helps the situation out a little bit. Alright, and it does. Great. Let's go ahead and work on this nav section still. We're still not quite done with that. So let's go nav li, which means any child list item of the nav area. I'm going to float those left. Each list item will be floated left. And then for the nav unordered list tag, let's go ahead and set its list style type to none. That should get rid of the bullets to the left hand side of each of the list items. So now let's refresh. Alright, almost done here. Not enough space. Let's put a little margin to the right hand side of each of these items. So let's go margin right 5 pixels, and let's refresh, and that looks a lot better. Great. Alright, I'm still not really satisfied with this section. It just doesn't look good. So what I'm going to do is style just the H1 and the H2 that are inside of the H group. I'm going to try and remove some of the dead space, make it kind of collapse up against itself, and I'm going to change the way that this is rendered to make it all caps. It'll be a small version of caps. So to do that, let's go to the H group, and right under that I'm going to go H group H1. So any H1 contained inside of an H group, and let's set the padding top. Let's just zero that out and see if that helps. And then I'm going to also set the line height to 1 EM. So that should reduce the overall line height consumed by that header 1. So hopefully that'll pull everything up together vertically. Furthermore, I'm going to go H group H2, and we'll do something neat here. Text transform, spell it right here, transform, and we're going to put uppercase. Cool. And then we'll go font size 1.2 EM, so 20% larger than a normal font. And I'm going to go ahead and set its line height to 1 EM to reduce the amount of space it takes up vertically. And that should be all I need to do. Let's see what that gets us here. So you notice the workflow. I make a small change, I test it, make a small change, test it. Alright, so I like that it's kind of pulled itself up a little bit more. Let me try one more thing on this H2. No, I think that's good. We'll leave it at that for now. That'll be good. One thing I'm not satisfied, however, is the amount of space that the header takes up relative to the amount of space that the section takes up. And I think there's a number of different ways to correct this. But if I were to add a padding around all sides, it would push everything out 5 pixels in every direction. And I think that'll be enough space to rectify this problem. So let's go back up to, let's find the section, and then I'm going to just padding 5 pixels, and by setting one setting, it'll set it to the top, right, bottom, and left all at one time. I could specify individual values for each, but not going to do it here. And you can see that that works. Everything lines up really nicely now. Great. Getting close. Hey, while we're here, let's go ahead and take care of this image. I'd like to push the images to the right-hand side. I'd like the text to flow around them. I would like also to have a drop shadow. So to make that happen, let's go ahead and right underneath the paragraph tag, I'm going to do an image. And inside of the image, I'm going to set the float equal to the right. So I'm going to make it butt up against the right-hand side instead of the left-hand side. Let me set a margin, and I'm going to specify each side individually, starting at top, and think about a clock. It starts at midnight and works its way around. So the top value, I'll have no margin. To the right-hand side, no margin. To the bottom, I want to put 10 pixels between the image and any text that might try to butt up to the bottom of that image. And then also the same to the left-hand side. Let's see how that works. Alright, so that works, and you can see we get some spacing here and some spacing here of at least 10 pixels. Alright, so that's good. Now let's work on that drop shadow behind it, and to create that I'm going to just go box shadow, and this is kind of a convoluted set of values, but they have to do with offsets, the amount of how precise or how blurry the drop shadow is, and so on. And then this would be the color of the drop shadow, a light gray color. All right, so let's take a look at what that produces for us. All right, so a nice subtle drop shadow, which makes it pop off the page just a little bit. Very nice. All right, so let's move all the way down to the footer and finish that up. I don't like how wimpy the footer is. I'd like it to have a much more pronounced height, but the content inside of it at this point isn't going to really take up that much space. So what I'll do is find the footer, and I'm going to set the height to 50 pixels. That should make it a little thicker and bulkier. Alright, that's nice. Still have some issues with not quite coming out to the full width that we need to match everything else that we've done. And so let me add a padding like we did above, and I think 10 pixels should do it. So let's go padding, and to get 10 pixels around every side, you just have to type it in one time. Save that, and now refresh one more time, and now it looks great. And there's probably more I could do to pull this section up more to the upper right hand corner. Doing so would probably affect how it works here as well, but I'm going to leave that alone. The final thing that I'm going to do is deal with this little aside area. If you recall, we're going to give it a smaller font. We're going to make it smaller than the rest of the text. We're going to give it a bright green background, and then a border with rounded corners. So that should be exciting. Let's go ahead right before the footer here and aside. And so I'm going to make this 80% of its parent, which will be the article, which would be the section. We're going to use that trick where we center it. So margin right auto, margin left auto. And we'll make the we'll set the font size a little bit smaller, so we'll use 0.8 EM. Okay, so let's see what we get so far. Well, actually, let's do one or two more things, and then let's take a look at it. Look at the background. And I happen to have a bright green background color here in hexadecimal. So you can do hexes in capitals or lowercase, doesn't matter. So EEFF99. Save that. Now let's see what we get. Go all the way to the bottom. Okay, so we're off to a good start. We need some padding, and then we obviously need that border with the rounded corners. So let's add padding to all sides, 20 pixels. And then we're going to set a border, and I'm just going to use some shorthand here. Instead of using each of the individual border properties like we did here, we can use a shortcut and just do 1 pixel solid and then give it a color. 696, and that would imply a second set of 696. But we'll just use a shortened form, in this case, of the hexadecimal color, the dark green color. Alright, so let's look at that. Awesome. One last thing, we need that rounded corner. So to get that, we're going to use border dash radius and set that to 20 pixels. If I wanted a smaller border radius, a tighter radius, I can make this like 10. If I wanted it larger, I can make it 50 or something very pronounced. Also make it almost look like a pill shape. So now we get the rounded corners. Awesome. And as I just comb through it here one last time, this looks about like what I had envisioned in my mind, and you could continue tweaking for days and days. It's not the best looking web page I've ever seen, but it's certainly not the worst out there on the internet. So all good for at least one video. It served its purpose. It was a brief whirlwind introduction to cascading style sheets. I'm sure you have tons of questions. I used a dizzying number of CSS properties, and I didn't try to explain what all of the special characters like PX and EM and this just briefly explain the hexadecimal version of a color and things of that nature. All of that will be explained in due time when we get to those parts of the series. So let's go ahead and push forward into the next lesson so we can get started talking about HTML5. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this lesson, we're going to dive deep into the code that we wrote in the previous lesson to make sure we really understand the HTML that we're writing. And to that end, make sure that you've downloaded the code that's associated with this lesson. It's available from wherever you're currently streaming the video or wherever you originally downloaded the video file from. Inside of that zip file, there should be a folder called Lesson 04. Inside of that folder, there should be a test.html page, which we'll use in just a moment, and then a before folder. And the before folder is merely a snapshot of where we left off from in the previous lesson. So you'll see the lesson 03.html page, the styles.css page and then a couple of image files. And so what we want to do is open up the lesson03.html file in Notepad. There are many different techniques. Use the technique you're most comfortable with. For me, I'm going to right click and select Open with Notepad. And so ultimately you should see on your screen what I'm looking at on my screen. Okay? So in lesson 2 we worked together to add HTML5 tags to an existing document in order to give it structure. And then in lesson 3 we applied styles to our HTML5 document using cascading style sheets. And I hope by now you have clear in your mind the difference between HTML5 and CSS. HTML5 is for structuring the content. CSS3 is for styling the content. So we have two concerns here and we're keeping them separated. Content and presentation, content structure and styling information. We keep them separated, and there are some big benefits to keeping the style sheet information separated out, even separated out into its own file. The biggest of which is that we can apply those styles to many web pages in the same website or in many different websites. So sure, you could mix the styling information directly in with your HTML, and you'll see many pages on the internet do this. You'll see that even I will use this technique a couple of times just to show you how it's done, but you'll quickly see that you should never take this tactic whenever you're building real web pages, because it'll make it difficult to reuse those styles in the future. Furthermore, there's a larger philosophical issue here as well regarding semantic purity, and we'll talk about semantic purity later in this video. Okay, so let's dive into the HTML5 page that we're looking at right here that we created in lesson 2 and 3. I want to explain why we did what we did, and I want to start at the very top and work my way down. So first of all, we have this doc type, angle brackets, exclamation mark, doc type in all caps, and then lowercase HTML. Looks very official, right? But what is it doing? Well, it's simply an instruction to the web browser explaining which set of rules that it should use to interpret this, or rather parse this document. Each version of HTML has a different set of rules, and those rules are set out in, ideally, a specification. In lesson 3, I showed you an HTML5 validator. Remember the validator.nu? We used it to ensure that we were following the rules of HTML5 in our document. And remember, we weren't. It found a couple of mistakes, and we fixed those. It used the doc type declaration to determine which set of rules that it should check our document against. So this HTML5 doc type is pretty simple to remember. For contrast's sake, take a look at what the doc type from a previous version of HTML, XHTML 1.0 strict, it looks something like this as you see on screen. XHTML 1.0 strict essentially treated your web page as an XML document. Now I'm tempted here to go off into a long explanation of what XML is and the history of how XHTML 2.0 died in favor of HTML5, but for the sake of brevity, just know that there's an interesting backstory about how HTML5 came about in the first place, and keeping that in mind, let's go ahead and just keep moving forward here with the important stuff. So compared to XHTML 1.0 strict in general, HTML5 is really laid back. In fact, if we open up validator.nu and we were to go to this validator input and set that to text field, and it gives you this little template here, let's delete everything out of it except just the title and the doc type, like so. And if you click validate, that's all that's required in order to get this markup to validate as a valid HTML5 document. Okay, it's pretty crazy. So I guess the moral of the story is that HTML5 is extremely forgiving. In fact, the absence of hard and fast rules or syntax styling rules was one of the design goals of HTML5 in the first place, to not break the web. If it already is working in today's web browsers, well, allow it to keep on working. Don't do anything that would break existing web pages if you can help from it. So the practical result is that HTML5 is a very forgiving declarative language. It accepts many different syntax styles. And as an instructor, I would merely say, find a syntax style that works for you and stick with it. Now, what exactly do I mean by the words syntax style? Well, up to this point, I've only used one syntax style, the one that I'm most comfortable with. But ultimately, there are many different ways that you can write HTML5. For example, you can choose to use all cap letters or all lowercase letters whenever you're defining tags. Most people are going to use the lowercase, but I've seen it done both ways. Previous versions of XHTML required to use all uppercase, for example. Then there's the difference of how you set values to the attributes inside of given tags. For example, if I were to, on this div tag, set the class equal to important, I can choose to use double quotes around the word important or choose not to. I still recommend you use the double quotes around it. You can choose to use self-enclosing tags or to omit the enclosing tags. So in the case of a cell defined within a table, and we'll talk about that much later, you can choose to define cells just as a open close angle bracket TD, or you can include the closing /TD in order to define one specific cell. It's up to you. Again, most people, I think, if they're coming from a background in writing HTML, are more comfortable with including the enclosing tags. There's also the notion of self-enclosing tags. You can see there's a BR or a line break. You can either write it without the self-enclosing tag. In other words, at the very end, you see how there's a space / angle bracket. That's just another style. You can choose either styles. They both represent the same thing. So it's really up to you. Now, if you go out on the internet, you search around, you're going to find heated debates about which style is the best. I'm going to leave it up to you. Pick one and stick with it. You can choose the one that I use, which is very close to what you might see in previous versions of HTML, just because that's where I'm comfortable, what I'm comfortable with. Okay, so let's shut this down. Let's get back to this document. And at a high level, whenever we were creating the tags around our document, we started off by declaring an HTML tag. It sits almost at the very top, and it's closed at the very bottom. Furthermore, inside of that HTML, or children to that HTML tag, there were two major sections. There's this head section. So here's an open head and a closed head. And then there's this body, and then at the very end, or almost at the end, you can see where the body tag is closed. All right, so an HTML tag can include a head section and a body section. All right, these define the major boundaries of an HTML page. Now, you might find it interesting that even these are not required in HTML5. You can still create a valid HTML5 document without these, like we saw just a moment ago. Web browsers will actually do you a favor, I guess, and insert the HTML head and body tags in as the browser is going through and parsing your document, no matter whether you declare them or not. And just to demonstrate that, here we have this test.html page. If we were to open it up and look at it in Notepad, you can see that it's very simple. We've just included the word hello world inside the title, and I've added a paragraph, hello world, in the body. If you were to open it up in Internet Explorer by double clicking it, it's a very simple web page. What's interesting about this is if we were to go to the options over here on the right and select F12 Developer Tools, and then make sure that the HTML tab is selected here in the F12 Developer Tools, it shows you kind of an outline for the document as it parsed through it, interpreted it, and as it begins to render it. And so this is how Internet Explorer sees our document. Notice that it inserted an HTML, a head, and a body. And we can drill in and see that the head owns a title, and the title owns the word hello world, which we see on our tab. And then the body owns a paragraph, which has the word hello world, like we see right here. And even as we select it, it puts a little line or a little box around it, okay? So the moral of the story here again is that even if you don't insert these yourself, the web browser will typically add them for you. Now, we can just skip the HTML, the head, and the body tags, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we should leave them out. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. I think there's a couple of reasons why I'd recommend that you explicitly continue to add the HTML, the head, and the body tags even in your HTML5 pages. And the first reason is because we're really in a transitional phase right now. Some people know HTML5, but I'm guessing the majority of people out there aren't familiar with it just yet. So to avoid confusion, keeping these main structural elements in place might actually be good for people who are trying to understand your web page and as they continue to make changes to it or work on it in some capacity. Furthermore, there are some helpful attributes that can be added to these tags to perform some helpful tasks. So take, for example, our HTML tag at the very top. I've added an attribute called lang for language, and I've set that equal to the letters EN for English. It's there to help search engines or other tools like speech synthesizers, spelling or grammar checkers, or help the browser select the correct font glyph for a given language. So do you have to use lang equals en? No, not necessarily. However, it's considered by some people to be a best practice. And therefore, to use it, we have to include the HTML tag here as we define our web page. So to summarize, I'd recommend you continue to use HTML head and body tags, even though you and I really know that we don't need to add them. It's still considered a good practice, okay? Okay, so as I said a moment ago, an HTML document has two parts, the head and the body. The head contains information about the body of the document. The body contains the HTML that will be parsed and then ultimately displayed by the web browser. The head can contain a bunch of different things. Now we've seen here that it contains the title and it contains a link to our style sheet, but it can also contain a meta tag. The head is pretty flexible. In fact, it can contain entire style sheet definitions, JavaScript or links to external JavaScript files, and multiple meta tags. So first let's start with this meta tag at the very top. This particular meta tag deals with the char set. So meta char set equals UTF-8. So what are meta tags exactly? Well, the term meta is used often in information technology. It merely means extra information that adds context about something. Okay, in this case, meta tags in HTML add context to the HTML document. So then, what is the char set and why is it set to UTF-8? And what context does that give to our HTML document in this specific case? Well, unfortunately, this is a pretty complicated topic. Again, I'm tempted to go off into a really detailed explanation because I find it fascinating personally. But let me merely direct you to this article for more information. It was written by the owner of a company called Fog Creek Software. Here, let's turn this off. And his name is Joel Spolsky, and he wrote an article called The Absolute Minimum Every Software Developer Absolutely, Positively Must Know About Unicode and Char Sets. No excuses. All right, so at any rate, most professional web developers recommend that you include the char set declaration. At a minimum, you should at least understand what it is and why it's important to have it there and what the history of it is. And this is one article that would help you determine that. They also recommend that you make sure that you're saving your documents using UTF-8 and that your server is set up to serve UTF-8. So as we saw in Notepad already, whenever we're saving as, we want to make sure to set the encoding to UTF-8. As far as the server is concerned, each individual software, whether it's Internet Information Services on Windows-based servers or Apache on Linux-based servers, you just have to make sure that the server is set up to correctly serve UTF-8 documents. So ultimately, if your international users ever report seeing these weird characters in their web pages, like black diamonds that have a question mark, a white question mark in the middle, you may have to investigate this further and see what's wrong with either your declaration, the way you've saved your web page, or the way that your server is set up to serve out those types of files. Okay? Okay, so what other types of meta tags could be added instead of or in addition to the char set UTF-8? Well, take a look on screen. I've got a couple of examples here. We have a description, a keywords, an author, a revised, and then also a refresh. And so some of these are used purely for SEO purposes. For example, description just allows you to explain the purpose of this given web page. Same thing with keywords, what keywords are closely aligned to this web page, so that if somebody's searching for it, the given search bot, engine bot, might use this to help determine your ranking. There's also information about who originally authored the web page, the last time the document was modified in any way. And then there's this HTTP equiv equals refresh content equals 60. Basically, this just says that the information on this web page could change potentially often, and so like a news website, for example, and so you should continue. The browser should take that as a cue to refresh the web page automatically every 60 seconds. Okay. So next up, we have the title. We've already talked about this. The title is simply the text that you want displayed in the web browser's title bar or in the tab's title area. Okay. Then we have this link, and we've talked about it already in the previous lesson. It was fairly simple to understand. All the attributes of the link element are basically rel, which is the relationship. So what is the relationship of this link document to this document? In this case, the relationship is that it's a style sheet. Secondly, the href is where you can find this style sheet or this external file. Then there's the type. What type should we interpret this file as? It's a text/CSS file, all right? And there are some very specific types that are available to you to use here. And then finally, there's this notion of media equals screen, and we'll talk about this much later whenever we're talking about building responsive web pages, all right? So when you think of the head section, think simply additional information about the document, even referenced inside of the document, but not necessarily displayed within the browser itself, all right? All right, so next up is the body, and you can see that takes up the lion's share of our file. And I'm tempted to talk about the body tag and what goes on inside of it. However, we're going to be spending really the next 7 video lessons on this topic. So let me just talk about the goings-on of the body tag at kind of a higher level. I've used up to this point the term semantics or the term semantic meaning a couple of times so far in this video series. Simply put, when I use the term semantics in relation to HTML5, I'm talking about the implied meaning of a part of the HTML document so that a machine, or I suppose even a human reading the code, could interpret the subject matter going on inside of those HTML tags, okay? So the hope is that by being one of the first generation of web developers to mark up our web pages using these rich semantic tags, we're laying the groundwork for developers to add semantically smart software to interpret our web pages. So for example, search engine spiders or screen readers for the visually impaired, and maybe other ideas that in 2012 I can't conceive of, but the next generation of developers have this rich foundation to build on top of and be able to extract pieces and parts out of the documents that we mark up in this manner. So, for example, by adding a nav tag to our web page, a visually impaired person could theoretically go directly to that part of the web page using a special key on their keyboard and more easily navigate our entire website. Or a search engine bot could skip all of the design chrome around of a web page and go directly to the main articles or sections of the web page more accurately. And these are just some of the examples, again, that we can conceive of today. Over time, it's possible that by embracing the notion of adding semantics or meaning to our web pages, it'll pay off in a big way long term. I'm going to have more to say about this as we continue through this series, but for now, when you hear me say semantic meaning, you'll know everything that I'm implying by that. Okay? All right, so let's move on and talk about HTML5 browser support. So HTML5 is relatively new, right? So it stands to reason that older web browsers are unaware of the newer tags that have been added to HTML5. This is why I want to work with Internet Explorer 9.0 or greater in this series of videos. Still, we know that it takes time for people to upgrade their web browsers, and some people may never upgrade. So what are you going to do about that as a web developer? Should you avoid HTML5 altogether and only code HTML 1.0? Well, all I'm going to say is that in this series, we're going to talk about HTML5 and CSS3, the number of issues and workarounds that you could employ to try and make HTML5 and CSS3 effects work inside of older browsers could easily make up a series of lessons on its own, and I'm going to leave that to somebody who's much more knowledgeable and talented than I am in that area. I would just say that if you're learning HTML today and you don't have a deadline in the near future for a project that has to work on every single web browser ever created from the beginning of time, then please focus on HTML version 5. The world will catch up with HTML5 eventually, and you'll be positioned well at that point. And frankly, most browsers will ignore tags that they don't recognize. So usually, even if you look at an HTML5 page in an older web browser, it's still going to look probably okay. It may not always look nice, but it'll usually render at least to some extent. Okay? If you really want to know how to make the new HTML5 tags work in older web browsers, then you might want to do a quick search on the internet for a JavaScript file called HTML5 shim that brings many HTML5 features to older web browsers. Okay. Furthermore, you might want to learn more about the notion of progressive enhancements. It's a style of building websites that begins with keeping older web browsers in mind during web development and then progressively enhancing, but not requiring, new features like those in HTML5 for the page to render properly. So if the user happens to be using a newer web browser, then great, it'll all work, and they're going to be able to take benefit from the enhanced features that you've added in. But if they don't have a newer web browser, then they can still count on the page to render itself and to be useful to them in some way. And Wikipedia is a great starting spot for learning more about the notion of progressive enhancement. There are other features of HTML5 that we're not going to talk about in this series. So in this series, we're going to be spending most of our time talking about semantic tags. We're going to spend time with the new tags that allow you to create forms to collect information from users and a lot more. Then at the very end of the series, I'm going to briefly talk about the HTML5 canvas, SVG, or in other words, scalable vector graphics, and then also embedding video using HTML5. And there are some other features that allow developers to do cool stuff, like create offline applications or to save data in a browser-based database and a lot more. However, I'm not going to be covering those in this series. I'm also not going to be covering some CSS Level 3 improvements like CSS3 transitions, which allow you to animate portions of your web page. So when you use that in conjunction with the HTML5 canvas and a little bit of JavaScript, you could conceivably create simple games that replace Flash or Silverlight plugin content. CSS3 animation and HTML5 and JavaScript involves advanced techniques and concepts and could easily earn a video series of its own, and these are definitely areas that you can pursue after you complete this series. Alright, so HTML5 features are being added all the time with each new release of all the popular web browsers. If you're curious about an HTML5 feature and you want to check on each browser's current support of that feature, then you can check out this website. I've actually created a bookmark for it here. It's called caniuse.com, and you can search for a particular feature of CSS or HTML5, and it'll tell you, for example, what's supported by each given web browser and which version. Okay?